texting or online, but I'm just going to start out, Mike. I met you, I don't know, a month or two ago, introduced by John Laukinen, one of our elders, as a friend of yours, and I was really appreciative of getting to that because I interviewed him and talked with him and called him on the phone even this week and said, hey, did I get this quite right? Change it a little bit. Okay, thank you, because I'm not the biologist. But Mike, could you tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to do what you're doing, and what is it that you're doing? Yeah.
So I got my bachelor's in biology at UCCS, and unless the battery's going dead.
Yeah, it's probably, Sawyer, can we give him that new mic?
Now? All right. There we go. So yeah, I've been interested in the question of our origins for a very, very long time. And to answer some of the questions that I was looking to answer required a tremendous amount of schooling. And I would be totally happy just to continue going to school forever, but it turns out that's actually expensive. So I spent like 5 years at UCCS, took every class I could get on biology, chemistry, evolution, geology. I mean, they all kind of intermingle where, you know, all of it was important. And then when I graduated, I got my bachelor's in biology and then decided that if I could somehow get someone else to pay me while I go to school, then that would be a platform for learning even more than I need to know. So from there, I applied to graduate school, got into graduate school out in New York, got my master's in toxicology, went on for a PhD in toxicology, and now I'm doing my second postdoctoral fellowship studying virology because I have a hypothesis about viruses having played a much bigger part in the fall and gene transfer than anyone has recognized previously. But in order to test that, I need to understand a great deal about what viruses are actually doing, what their purpose is, and they're actually very good at editing your genetics, by the way. There's a lot of good evidence for that being the case, but in order to do that, I need to somehow earn money along the way. And so I'm now doing my postdoctoral fellowship, and my aim is either to get a job maybe at the CDC. I applied recently. So ideally, if I could do that, then I would get paid to study viruses on a daily basis and spend the next 2 decades really developing my theory. And if not, the goal would be to be a college professor and then just continue taking those classes while I taught on the side. So 20 years down the road, I should know maybe the beginnings of enough to really...
Yeah, so anything he says today, you kind of take it with a grain of salt, right? I'm kidding. Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike. Sawyer, do we have any questions that were texted in this morning or anything online? Could you check for that real quick? What's the number? Well, we're going to let you just ask him with a microphone. Jenna, John, you got to be bold tonight.
And I know I have questions that I feel like...
Is that your brother?
The guy that looks exactly like me?
Yeah. Okay, he's the one. Don't let him have the mic. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Sawyer, do we have any we can start out with?
If that's the one that I was using, yeah, good luck.
Check. There we go. One from was texted in. How do we know that the Genesis author is divinely inspired and not just making up a story?
That really comes down to the history. So that's not as much a biology question as you need to really get into the historical evidence for the Bible. But the short answer to that is that if you look at the Bible as a whole, the author that wrote Genesis, I believe it was Moses that it's attributed to, that each of those authors will tend to link arms almost with authors in the future. So you'll have like Abraham talking about, we'll use Jesus for instance, who talks about Abraham and prophesying, about his coming. You've got prophecies in the Bible that they make a darn good case for there being a God. Some of the things, particularly in Daniel, if you look through Daniel, there are some really interesting prophecies. The day that Jesus was supposed to show up was prophesied. It's very interesting if you look into prophecy. Now, there also are historical arguments there where they'll say, oh, well, it was written after the fact, and you really have to know the history to get at that. But to come back to that question, the point is the Bible, the way that it's written, with all of the authors kind of linking arms and saying, if you believe me, you must believe everybody that came before me, because I'm standing on their shoulders and telling you they're real prophets, and now from that point, I'm going to now have the next revelation. So the Bible really is a very cohesive whole. And so that may be a better question for more of a historian, but from what I know, well, I know it to be the case. The Bible actually has, historically, the evidence for the Bible is better than any ancient historical source, particularly for Jesus. I've been watching a lot of videos on how do we know if Jesus, actually came, did he actually perform miracles, like those sorts of things. And there's actually a tremendous amount of evidence for that. But my answer to that would actually be it's more important to understand the history than necessarily the biology.
Yeah.
If that,
Yeah, and if you believe Jesus, Jesus believed that the first 2 chapters of Genesis were true.
Yeah.
He taught it. So if you believe him, you should believe that too. There you go.
Yeah.
Summary. Questions? Sawyer, could you pass it around? It looks like we have a first one from Luke right here without any shoes.
Is that how I'm going to be known here?
Barefoot Luke.
How you doing, Mike?
Doing good.
My question would be more or less the population of the earth. When Adam and Eve created offspring, it's evident that that offspring had to commit incest in order to populate the earth. We know now that if 2 people were to do that today, that wouldn't work out so well. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So it has to do with, so if I were to restate that maybe in even a harder way, so if you were to assume that, if you were to make the case that the Bible is literally true, and you'd say God made Adam and Eve, there's no other people on earth, all people came from just these 2 people in the garden. Their kids would then have to have babies with themselves, which would then have to have babies with themselves, and you've got the world's biggest case of incest. How do we not have a tremendous amount of disease and all the things that you see happen today whenever brothers and sisters have kids together? And to answer that, you actually have to understand why it is that today brothers and sisters can't have children together. And the answer to that is genetics. So if you were to examine my genetic code, let's say that you've got a gene for a heart valve protein, for instance, okay? And I inherited 1 protein from my mom, and I inherited 1 protein from my dad, right? If I got 1 working copy from my mom and a non-working copy from my dad, oftentimes what will happen is the working protein can make up for the non-working protein. Okay, so I have 1 functional copy, and as long as mom carries a functional, dad carries a non-functional, and I get 1, most of the time that works. The problem is, okay, so now imagine that, parents have a number of siblings, I marry my sister and we have kids. Well, now we're both likely to be carriers of this particular disorder. So when we have children now, if you look at how genes segregate, there's a 1 in 4 chance that our children will get the same defective gene from both of us because we are both closely related, so we tend to have the same defects. And so our children cannot have children together because you drastically increase the likelihood of getting those defects kind of built up. Now that wouldn't have been a problem if you assume that the original creation, that the genetics that we were created with didn't have broken pieces. So if we were created in a state where we didn't have any broken genes, then their kids could have as many children as they wanted with one another, and you don't have to worry about increasing the likelihood of getting these broken genes by siblings marrying. Does that make sense? Okay. And if we don't get questions, then I'll give you answers to things that I've thought of, so it's going to get real complex. Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is my first time visiting this church, but a couple years ago, I was taking some college classes, and I saw on the internet these created beings. I guess, according to the internet, they were created by the government, but they were made up different species, but other species. And like, for example, they created this web from spider webs, genetically mutated, strong enough to hang out the back of airplanes. And and they created other things that was on the internet. I don't know if it's real or not, but it looks scary to me. It was like a pig, and the bottom half of the pig was human. And it's like they created these genes to go together. And it was kind of scary. And in the article on the internet, it said that the government had to stop doing it because it was too scary what they were doing. And I was wondering, have you ever come across anything like that?
So there's a lot of stuff on the internet that you have to be aware of, but we can put genes from one species into another. That's done all the time. That one's actually very useful for doing science, something called green fluorescent protein, which is a jellyfish protein, and it will glow green. So for my graduate research, one of the goals was to study how a specific type of inhibitory interneuron migrates through the brain through development. Well, the question is, how do you track a cell through the brain? Well, if you can get a genetic model, so we often do this in mice, we can knock in a gene, or we can insert a gene. Well, if you insert green fluorescent protein under the control of, it's something called a promoter that all your cells have. If you put that under the control of a promoter specific to a neuron, you can get certain types of neurons to glow green. So for my project, for instance, if I wanted to know where the cell ended up in the brain, I would essentially insert this gene into the mouse, and then put that under the control of a promoter that was specific to the cell type that I wanted to study, and that cell would glow green. And then I could look at it under the microscope and actually see it glowing green. Now, that being said, there's a lot of really exciting, interesting things that we can do by combining these. If you see a picture on the internet of like half of a pig looks human and half looks pig, we don't have the capability to do that. A lot of times, it's just individual pieces that we're putting in, and that's how like genetically modified crops work. So you'll put in a gene, for instance. So let's say that you have a pesticide and you squirt it on your yard. You'll notice that some of the plants will die, but not all of them. So somebody came along and they asked the question, well, why don't these other plants die? Well, they have a different gene. Something about that plant is different. So if you then take the gene from that plant that didn't die with the pesticide and you put that into corn, for instance, now you can make corn that doesn't die when you spray a pesticide on it. So there's a lot of good things that you can do with them. And a lot of the stuff that we do, if you've heard of like CRISPR-Cas9, some people were worried about that for a while. But that was actually just a bacterial protein that allowed more specific gene editing. But a lot of things we can find in nature and then utilize specifically to our purposes. But it really comes down to what our purposes are. I think there are very scary things that people could do. Unfortunately, if you live in a society where it's very morally relative, I could see human beings being capable of doing a lot of very scary things. But I mean, our heart, we're kind of evil. That seems to be the way of it. So, but
like it showed that you could take like a lion and put a human brain in it, so it could be a smart lion. No, that can't be done.
No, I don't. Yeah, no, I would say no on that one.
Hey, can I change gears a little bit? Because in my message today, I mentioned one of the fifth hole in evolutionary theory that I didn't quite have time to really explain. And you talked about it a little bit in your video. So while we're passing the mic on to somebody else, could you explain that kind of fifth hole? I talked about it with you, but the idea that actually evolution, now that we've studied, is devolution. Could you talk about that?
I would actually argue that there's a lot more than 5 holes, but we'll stick with just that.
I try to summarize it.
Evolution actually points in the wrong direction. So it is capable of allowing for adaptation. So bacteria can populate more quickly, they can adapt to antibiotics, they can do things that seem to be beneficial. And if you don't understand the way that that's happening, it seems like upward progress. You think we put this antibiotic into a human and this antibiotic works on some of the bacteria, but not all of them. And so the ones that are, more fit, they can survive in you, and then they're causing these huge problems with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And you think, well, isn't that a perfect example of evolution? Like, how can you deny that? And it really comes down to understanding the way that evolution is working. And I guess a good example, using your car example, would be this. Let's say that you needed to make your car faster, right? And that your life depended on your car going faster. You could try to design an engine that's better than the one that's in there, but good luck with that. Most of us don't, not even close to knowing enough about an engine to do that. But a very simple fix for that would be to start taking things out of the car. So you take your back seats out, you take your doors off, you take your windshield out. All of that reduces weight in the car and makes it go faster. We see the same thing in bacteria. So bacteria can adapt, it absolutely happens. But the way that they're doing it is by dumping information. In fact, Richard Linsky he's a well-known evolutionary researcher. He's been doing research on E. coli for, I think it's up to like 60 or 70,000 generations in E. coli. It's getting pretty high. And what they see consistently throughout these entire experiments is at the beginning, bacteria adapt very well. You'll see, I'm gonna try to show you a curve here. If high is bacterial, how quickly they replicate, right? And down at the bottom is slow replication. You'll see an increase in how fast they're replicating. But what'll happen is it begins to level off and level off and level off until by the time you've reached 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, you're seeing minuscule increases in how fast these bacteria are actually able to replicate. And it's very much like, how many parts can you take off of your car to make it go faster? Well, you could take a lot, and at first there's a lot of stuff to take off, but you reach a point eventually where that will begin to level off, and there's nothing else you can take off. And you'll see the same sorts of things in evolution. And so if you actually look at how, so let me make that point first. So Richard Linsky's been doing these experiments, and what he finds in the E. coli that he's testing is a deletion bias. So in other words, when we look at the genomes of bacteria, they're actually shrinking. And we see that over and over and over again, where you're getting the loss of genes that had a function, but they don't need to function in that particular situation. So he's growing them in a particular media, in a controlled environment in his lab, so they don't need all of these extra genes that bacteria in the wild need. And so if they get rid of all of that stuff, sure, they can replicate much faster because they're not wasting energy on all this other stuff because they don't need it in the laboratory. But if you put those same bacteria back out into an environment where suddenly those things are important, or the car example, now you're driving around in the wintertime and you don't have a windshield, you are kind of out of luck. You can't evolve one back. That was actually, it's super easy to rip it out. It's much, much harder to put it back. And that's what we see over and over and over again, is that these genes are actually breaking. They're falling apart. And there can be advantages to that. There certainly are. And that's the case oftentimes for antibiotic resistance. And I'll give you a couple examples of antibiotic resistance. So you have to understand how antibiotics are actually killing the bacteria. And it comes down to, like, for instance, if an antibiotic needs to be pumped across the outer membrane, right? If that bacteria can live without the pump that's pumping the antibiotic, so it's not made for pumping antibiotics. So let's say you've got a pump that's made for pumping, some important nutrient that the bacteria needs, but that the bacteria can also synthesize, right? But if it doesn't have to, it would rather pump it in. And the antibiotic is tricking the bacteria into pumping antibiotic in, and it's then killing that bacterium, right? Well, if you break that pump and the bacteria can survive with a broken pump, and it becomes resistant to that antibiotic as a result, then you've now got a resistant bacteria. The thing is, you've now lost the function of that pump. Is that important? Well, in this instance, it was far more important that the pump be broken and that it was either death or a broken pump. And that was the choices.
You shared an example of like a basement when we talked.
Yes, yeah. And this is an example from Michael Behe, where he uses the example, if your basement is flooding, and you either have to evolve a complicated pumping mechanism to pump the water out of the basement back out of your house, or you can take a sledgehammer and sledgehammer a hole in the wall and it drains out. Evolution every single time will choose the option where it'll sledgehammer a hole in the wall. Now the water drains out. Of course, now you got a wet basement, but the problem is fixed. That leads to a lot of other issues because evolution every single time will work that way. But in order to evolve a complex pump, you've got to have some sort of driving force to do that, except that every time the driving force will choose the option that's quick and dirty. Well, if I can just punch a hole in the wall, we'll do that. Problem solved. I can live with a wet basement. That's not life or death. Every single time it happens that way. And so there's no driving mechanism towards these irreducibly complex systems. Rather, there is this kind of a temporary workaround. Well, I can survive with this, so let me go ahead and do this. Imagine that you had to keep your car running and you never had access to a mechanic. There'd be a lot of duct tape, things kind of stuck together, and that'll work for a while. It really will. But eventually it gets to that point where no amount of duct tape is going to fix it. At this point, you really have to have someone who knows what they're doing. And that's what it always comes down to. And so when we look at the way that evolution is actually working, it is always working that way. It's always a break in, something, or there's a caveat. It is also capable of minor adjustments of, you can think of like a key in a lock. It can do minor adjustments fairly well. And you can look at the mathematics of that and figure out how many adjustments it can make. So there are instances where it can subtly change, for instance, like how an enzyme recognizes. The sulfa drugs work this way. So this is an antibiotic. And there's an enzyme that the sulfa drugs will come in and they'll bind in that enzyme and they gum it up. And this enzyme is important for DNA synthesis, for making the building blocks of DNA, I should say. And what the antibiotic does is it sticks in that enzyme, and the enzyme can't tell the difference between what its substrate that it's supposed to be using and this antibiotic. Well, evolution is good at subtly changing the enzyme. So let's say that now you've got a piece sticking out that happens to pop the antibiotic out, but still kind of allows the substrate that it wants to bind, that can still kind of bind. So it comes a little bit at the cost of how good the bacteria can make DNA, but it prevents the antibiotic from binding. So there's a little bit of caveat there, but every time it happens, that is the direction of it. So the question that I would have is, how many parts do you have to take off your car to evolve it into an airplane, for instance? Right, and that's the problem. When I say that it's pointing in the wrong direction, that's what I mean. You're good at duct taping and taking parts off, but not good at evolving to things that require more complexity.
Questions, Kenton?
Hey, I was curious about what evolutionary biology would have to say toward why we have a self, a consciousness, or a spirit, however you want to refer to it. Like, what's the purpose that it serves?
They're very good at taking things that clearly have a benefit. And so I'll come back to that question, but let me set it up a little bit. So you might say, well, what is the benefit in having an opposable thumb? And you can think of all the cool stuff that you can do with it. And you say, well, of course we have one, because look at all the benefits that it affords us. The problem is, so the same thing I would say for consciousness. You can come up with a lot of reasons why it's beneficial to have a consciousness, and evolutionists oftentimes will. They'll talk about all the reasons why this would benefit us in the long run, all the reasons why this would be a good thing. The car example, I can think of if you need a mode of transportation. And let's say that cars hadn't been invented, and suddenly I invented one, and I could think of lots of reasons why cars are super good things. The problem is it doesn't say anything about the mechanism for creating a car. Sure, there's lots of advantages for having one. I don't disagree with that. I would absolutely wholeheartedly agree. If you had the option of, let's say, a gene that let you leave behind many more kids and live for 900 years, and you list off tons of good things, sure, that would absolutely be something that would take over. Or let's actually use an example in the animal kingdom. So let's say they have a gazelle that can run at 150 miles an hour, right? Well, in that case, and much more likely to survive, no doubt that would take over the population. It doesn't, however, get at the question of how does something like that arise? Because when you look at the actual way that these things are arising, the mechanism is always by eliminating things that it has to choose from. So natural selection selects from things that it has to choose from. And so you kind of select from what's there, and then you eventually select away all of your choices, and then you're not left with anything. So their answer would no doubt have to do with why we want to have it, while conveniently ignoring in any way how it might have evolved. I saw a documentary that was really, honestly, it was very dumb, but it was talking about how chimpanzees showed the beginnings of religion, and the example they used was like there's these chimpanzees that were like walking past a log, and one of them threw a rock at it, and then they all started like throwing rocks at this log, and they're like, see, it's superstition. Look at the chimpanzees think if they throw rocks at this log, and in science, if I tried to make that case with my mouse model and like, look at here, this mouse model, here's what the mouse is doing. It's sniffing its partner for 1.5 seconds longer. Therefore, I've cured, ADHD, people would laugh at me, they would never publish that paper. And yet in evolution, it's done all the time. They'll say, oh, look, they're throwing rocks at this log. That's the beginnings of evolution, and assume that somehow this just so story with 100 pieces that just maybe this, and then, kind of this, and then maybe this one worked like this. There you go. There's the explanation. Yeah, I could do that all day. And if you try to shoot those down, I'll spend my entire life shooting down just so stories. The problem is you actually have to have real evidence for it.
Okay, we got a bunch of questions, and
Yeah.
we're going to try to finish at 8, so
Okay.
let's do rapid fire.
Once again, thanks for taking our Q&A questions. This is it's really informative. I read what I thought was a really good book a few years ago called Spillover by David Quammen. Have you heard of that?
I've not.
Okay. It's all about zoonotic diseases.
Okay.
And specifically viruses. And I guess my first question is, one, do you believe viruses are living or dead? And two, where do you think they fit into evolution? I've never really heard a good answer. I know that's not so much more on the religious side, but I'm a biological engineer as well, or I'm nowhere near your education, but that's why you're here to answer these questions.
Yeah, no worries. It really depends on how you define life, and it always comes back to that. So life is basically the reason that we say they're not alive is because in and of themselves, they cannot replicate. They just kind of sit there. They require entry into your cells or an animal cell or a plant cell in order to replicate. So the argument is, if something completely relies upon you for replication, is that thing actually alive? So my thought would be no. I think they're just complex replicating systems, but I would say that they are not alive. And to answer your second question, I actually have a lot that I would say on that, because that is actually part of the reason I'm pursuing virology research. I actually have my own hypothesis about our origins. Now, I've got a lot more research to do, so I will give you kind of my thoughts on this and some of the rationale for it. No doubt there are pieces that will still need to be tinkered with. I'm still kind of putting the story together. But essentially, it goes something like this. If you imagine that the world that was originally created... Now, let me actually tell you a little bit where I'm coming from. There's actually good biological evidence that life could not even have existed for 3 billion years. If you look at how quickly these slightly deleterious mutations are building up in our genome, humans aren't going to be around for another billion years. Most life probably won't. We cannot survive. Natural selection is not strong enough to eliminate the slow buildup of mutations. So quite the opposite of mutations being something that's leading to more complicated things, mutations are actually slowly killing us, and we will all eventually succumb to them. Natural selection's not...
You heard it here first.
Happy. Well, luckily, if you... yeah. So that being said, I believe that we are much younger than that. So if you were to imagine a Christian worldview where the earth was created 6,000 years ago and created in a state where it could change to become the world that is today, the question that I ask myself is, well, what sort of world 6,000 years ago would lead to a world that we see today? And in order to answer that, it really gets at what God meant when he said everything was good. And so here's my thought. If you look at a world where everything is symbiotic, so in other words, a perfect example from nature is plants and animals, where animals will breathe in the oxygen that's made by plants and breathe out carbon dioxide, which is then taken in by plants, convert that back to oxygen. We need one another to survive. It's a symbiotic relationship. We don't take advantage of them. It's kind of like mutually beneficial. If you imagine that everything lived in a state like that prior to the fall, so everything was symbiotic. You have these microorganisms who live symbiotically with you, aren't causing disease, aren't doing these things, and you imagine a world like that. Now you imagine that humans make the decision that, you know what, I don't actually want to follow the Lord. I choose to be selfish. I choose to eat the fruit. I choose to do things my own way. What happens when you put a being like that into a world where everything is selfless, everything is symbiotic? What you would end up with is essentially the system would crash very, very quickly because nothing is really capable of defending itself like it needs to against something that's trying to take advantage of it, right? So there had to be some way for beings to be able to defend themselves. And so here's my thought on it. That I think the tree of knowledge of good and evil actually contained viruses. And if you look at the purpose of viruses, they are actually very good at changing you at the genetic level. You look at HIV, which can put its own DNA into yours so that it essentially co-ops your cells and makes them make more of itself. There's a lot of other stuff I have to say on this, but let me get the main point out first. If you look at the way evolution is working, this deletion bias, if you imagine that the original purpose of a virus was to genetically alter creation so that it had the capability of defending itself. Now, a good example would be like thorns on plants, which specifically was one of the curses. Pain in childbirth, and that's a whole section of this theory. You look at those things, poisons, for instance, snakes being poisonous. You look at these things, some of these things are very necessary for things to be able to defend themselves, and those genes had to come from somewhere. So my hypothesis is that they originally came from viruses, which were designed to change us at the molecular level, change your DNA to be able to survive in a world that is selfish. Now, if you look at what evolution, the way that we know that it works today, what it would have done to a system that, so in this case, needs to self-replicate, so it needs to get inside of your cells, it needs to change them genetically, it needs to insert genetic pieces into your DNA, and then it needs to come back out and infect others and do the same thing, right? Evolution acting on viruses, so viruses don't care if they carry the genes necessary for your survival, right? So if these things were originally designed to carry packets of DNA that were important for self-defense, evolution would eliminate those things until eventually, and viruses are actually one of the fastest evolving organisms, eventually you would end up with a situation where the only thing that was left was the actual replicating unit itself, which is what we see for viruses today. And so I think that actually that is the remains of what was originally designed to be a system that was made to genetically alter you. So for instance, thorns on plants. Yeah, and that's why I need to know everything there is to know about viruses, because there's a lot to know. And as evidence for that, for instance, the human genome, anywhere from 10 to 20%.
We got a couple more questions
manipulated.
that we're trying to get in the last 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, no worries.
You guys can take this offline maybe afterwards. Cool. We had one more over here. And then we had one back here with Harry, too, in between there. So then we'll do that, and those will be our last 3 questions for the evening, okay?
Maybe this can be quick, Mike. Could you speak to cloning? We've cloned a sheep, and at some level, we have test tube babies, which I get the basic science there, but can you speak to the fact if we can clone, then have we cracked any secret to generating life, or is that truly just a facade?
I mean, it's an advancement for sure, but cloning, I think, is kind of different. What we do for cloning is, from the latest that I understand, for Dolly at least, and I might be a little bit out of date because I don't specifically study cloning in particular, but we just took the genetic material out of an egg and so in this case, Dolly the sheep put genetic material from one of her somatic cells into an egg, and then basically the egg is primed to start the process of creating a being, and so we just put that in there. You also have to do a lot of editing. So there's these things called transcription factors, which will turn on and off certain pieces of the genetic code, and you have to make sure that the cell thinks that it's supposed to become an entire being. So you have to actually program them to do that, and you do that with adding a bunch of different chemicals onto them. But it certainly is an accomplishment. But yeah, that's probably most of, unless you have a specific. Okay.
Thanks. Hi. My question is kind of a children's church question, because it's something I've wondered about since I was a kid, and recently learned something about evolution that I'm wondering if you can confirm, and then maybe have an answer for the follow-up that now I'm wondering about. So, Noah's Ark. As a kid, I'm like, how did all the animals fit on the ark? This doesn't make sense to me. If you just think about a dog being one species, but it has Dalmatian and Great Dane and Dachshunds and Scotties, and how do they all fit on there? So recently I learned, maybe this is true, you can tell me if it's not, that okay, so you were speaking about how there's all these gaps in evolution, so it kind of seems to me at some point the flood kind of restarted evolution because only so many species were on the boat. That essentially there's like one species of dog. And then as the dogs start multiplying, like the short ones keep on hanging out and the dark ones keep hanging out and the white ones are hanging out. And then that's how all the species happen that we have now. Mm-hmm. So if that's correct, which you can confirm or deny, then my follow-up question is...
He knows too.
Yeah, awesome. My
there.
follow-up question is, do you have any idea how many actual types of animals were on the ark? Because I am very, very curious about that.
Yeah, it really depends on... Okay, so... no creationist will say that no change happens, first off. I feel like that's important to say. Because sometimes I feel like evolutionists will set up a straw man and say, well, we see these little teeny tiny changes, and you addressed this a little bit today. And they'll say, how stupid are you that you don't think those teeny tiny changes happen? But no creationist actually believes that. And so it really comes down to what the created kind was. So if you go backwards in time, you have natural selection, which is selecting from specific genes, right? So imagine you've got a gene for straight hair and a gene for curly hair, right? And so originally, you've got the ability to have either, so you're heterozygous for the trait. Then slowly, the curly-haired people move to one place, the straight-haired people move to another, hypothetically, right? You end up with all offspring being curly hair, all offspring being straight-haired. Now imagine that same process, but in reverse. So you've got dogs, right? Which I actually would say are the same kind as wolves, as coyotes, honestly probably as foxes, as there's a lot of animals you can group into that. So the original dog that the ark would have a tremendous amount of genetic variability compared to what we see today, because we have been inbreeding. We have been slowly spreading out, and slowly, as you spread away from that central part, you've got siblings that must, albeit maybe they're not brother or sister, but cousins. There are only so many options as you're spreading away from that central point, and you are selecting away those genetic, that heterozygous nature of those genes. So on the ark, there would have probably been, all right, so I would guess in the thousands of kinds, honestly. I think that we are capable of a lot more adaptation than people expect. A lot more change than what the typical Christian you would tend to think of. But God just says kind, and so he really comes back to when Genesis says the created kinds, our definition of species, by no means do we mean a kind equals a species. I would actually argue that the kind, I would guess, is probably closer to the family level, and that the creatures that were on the ark were more at the family level, and then you see these like saber-toothed cats and like these giant animals of the Ice Age, and you think, wow, these were crazy animals. I think that's just some of the genetic variability that was built into those kinds, and the things that live today are just the inbred survivors of evolution. And that is exactly what's happening. We're selecting away that variability.
So don't be a cat person, right? Thanks, Mike. Okay, there was one more back here from Harry. So
Hi, I have a quick question for you. What's your perspective on the mutagenesis, which could be sometimes inducible, spontaneous, and also unpredictable as well? How do you think that actually fit into the tuning argument of the God?
So mutagenesis, do you mean mutations? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. So mutations definitely do happen. And those are actually one of the ways that evolution works. And that's where irreducible complexity really comes in, because mutations really work in these like single hits, single changes at a time. And the idea behind, when I say evolution here, I mean the idea from molecules up to man, like we're slowly getting better and these mutations are being acted upon by natural selection. You really have massive hurdles to overcome with those mutations. Now they do allow the small adaptations that you see, for instance, with bacterial resistance to antibiotics. Mutations would be one example of how the enzyme that I use for the sulfa drug, that enzyme might change in order to knock out the sulfa drug, but still recognize the molecule that it's supposed to be recognizing. So mutations absolutely do occur, and they allow some fiddle room with evolution. The problem is that they also build up. And one of the major issues is, if you've ever heard the idea that most of our DNA is junk DNA, I'm sure most of you have probably heard that spouted out there. The reason that that's particularly important to evolution is because we are accumulating mutations. Now, if you imagine that most of our DNA is junk and it doesn't do anything, then you don't have a problem with the amount of mutations that are building up, because you could make the case, well, it's happening in these regions that aren't doing anything. We have all of these regions of our DNA. If those are just junk, then no problem. We don't have issues with mutation rate being too high and killing off our species. The problem is, as we learn more and more and more about the genetic code, it's true, protein coding region is actually a fairly small portion of the genome, but you've also got a lot of control regions, and it turns out RNA is actually doing a lot more than we ever realized. You have these long non-coding RNAs, you have these small RNA pieces, and all of them are actually responsible for many things in the cell. RNA even has catalytic capabilities. And the more we're learning about the way that the cell works, the more we're realizing that DNA actually has more and more and more of it, it turns out, is very important, that it's just the way that it is. And so it's really becoming a problem, because as the amount of DNA that actually turns out to be very useful and very important, as that number goes up, you run into a real issue, because now there's nowhere to hide all those mutations. You can't say that those mutations are building up in areas of the genome that don't matter. Now you've got to somehow account for, well, how can natural selection eliminate these things, given the fact that we now know that they're building up and that the genome actually has a lot of function. And so it actually ends up being a real big problem, and I think it will only continue to get worse as we continue to discover more and more what the DNA is actually doing and what RNA is doing, and how much of this coding region actually is vitally important to the function of your cells.
In one of the books I read for this was Michael Behe's Darwin Devolves, and he specifically talks about a computer model, so maybe you could take it, because he published a paper and evolutionary biology says, oh, you were way off on this. So what they did was, if you just had 2 gene mutations that you wanted to be beneficial, well, it can't just be any of the genes, any of the millions or billions of genes, they have to be just the 2 right ones to create the thing that you want. So just 2. Most structures are hundreds, right? But if you just wanted 2, that the evolutionary biologist came back and said, on a computer model, to get the 2 that actually work, that are beneficial, would take 100 million generations. Just statistically, to get the 2 operating at the same time. I don't know, we talked about this briefly. 100 million generations. Think about how many billions and billions of years that would take for 100 million generations of most species, just to get 2 genes. So it seems like mutation isn't a good explanation. I don't know, correct me, I'm probably wrong.
Well, the other thing you've got to be careful of, though, so that is, if the mutations are independent of one another, then you get the big numbers. The thing that you'll immediately run into when you're talking to someone who, when they say evolution, they mean this upward progression, is they'll say, aha, but you get one and it's beneficial, and then that sticks, and then you have the advent of another one, and then another one, and each one of those is beneficial on their own, and they slowly build up. In that case, you get around the numbers. The problem is that oftentimes they are not these individual steps. Certainly some mutations are that way. You can happen in 1 or 2 or 3 steps. But some of these require much, much bigger jumps. And I'm pressed for time. There's like big ideas I want to present, but it'll take time. We can let people go if you want, but...
Yeah, let's do that, and then if they want to stick around and ask you. So, Mike, I know that you sometimes do lectures, and you have even like a Bible study just on this stuff. If people want to find out more, how can they just talk with you?
Nick,
do you have a website or
something? They're welcome to come chat with me. I can put... This is something I'm really passionate about. I feel like I worship a God of truth. I'm not afraid of delving into stuff and finding out that my God's not real. I've been worried about that in the past, and I have delved into it enough times now that it seems like when I come across a problem that seems like a major problem, and it really kind of causes me to just vacillate on, well, am I completely wrong? What is going on here? I find that when I really delve into that and understand at the deepest levels, so sometimes that takes years, but when I do that, I find out that there are almost always interpretation that goes into that. And what you will often get is you will get presented stories, and they will tell you true things, but they'll present them in a way that leads you to a false impression. And actually, a friend of mine gave me a perfect example of this. So if I was late for work and I, got there and my boss is like, "Why were you late?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm really, really sorry. There's terrible traffic. I really wanted to make it into work, but the traffic was terrible." And the boss would be left with the idea that, "Oh, I got stuck in traffic, right?" Well, what actually happened was I forgot to, I stayed up late, I snoozed my alarm, I drove to work, and there was traffic in the southbound lane, and it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. My lane didn't have traffic, but they did. And so while I said a true thing, like, it's true, there was traffic, there's terrible traffic. It has nothing to do with, it's not why I'm late, but you're left with, so I can tell you true things and give you a false impression. And actually, if you wanted to stick around, there's a perfect example of that with the evolution of the ability to digest citrate. And this is one that I came across and actually caused...
And that's a great one.
Give me 2 minutes. 2 minutes, I'll present it. And I won't go into any of the detail. But the idea was that E. coli, it evolved the ability to digest citrate where it hadn't had that ability prior to. And here you have E. coli as a species is defined on their ability to not digest citrate. And here you have the evolution of the system. It ended up being true, but it's the details that mattered. And it actually shows that evolution can't have happened when you actually understand the details, but the story that you presented makes you think that you were actually in the wrong. And that's more often than not what'll happen. So I would just encourage you, if someone presents something and you're like, "Wow, that really makes me question," delve into detail. Look at it in great depth, because if you do that, it seems like those problems always go away.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike. Can we give him a round of applause? I've appreciated this so much. We've had a whole bunch of conversations, and I've not even scratched the surface with how much he knows. So I'm going to say a prayer, and then we'll dismiss. Lord God, thank you so much for this night that we could learn and grow as we just pursue truth together, because you are the God of all truth. And I just pray that you bless Mike for his boldness to come and share with us tonight, and help us, all of us, go out of here trusting that you are the God of the universe. You are the God of the cell. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.